I want you to look at this.
Taliban wants to make a deal.
Did you see it?
Biden spoke to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and urged him to take the deal.
If you didn't notice, I'm not talking about the meeting. I'm not talking about the two sides. I'm talking about who is hosting these negotiations.
Qatar says negotiations to free some hostages.
Brokered by Qatar.
Citizens, that's smaller than a lot of American cities.
Brokered by familiar major powers in the Middle East, and perhaps one less familiar, Qatar.
Palestinian militant group Hamas striking Israel with thousands of rockets.
Now, if you're anything like me, you're probably wondering how a tiny island petrostate in the middle of the Persian Gulf would have the same diplomatic sway in the global stage as global superpowers such as the United States, Russia, and China. To really understand how Qatar became the preeminent diplomat in the Middle East region, we need to go back in time, all the way back to the 1990s, and very specifically to one man. His name was Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, the Emir of Qatar between 1995 and 2013. Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani is basically the father of modern day Qatar. Under his guidance, he founded a new era in Qatar's diplomacy across the Middle East. Al Thani's first major move was the creation of Al Jazeera in 1996. Okay, wait. You're probably asking yourself right now, if you live in the West, you're like, Al Jahu? Al Jazeera. It is one of the premier broadcasting news corporations in the entire world. It is the biggest multimedia news corporation in the Gulf/Arab world. It competes on the same level as BBC, CNN on the multimedia news stage, and it was founded by Al Thani himself in 1996 to help promote Qatar's diplomacy across the world and to help promote their vision of what Middle East diplomacy, politics, and Qatari image should look like across the globe. The next major move was to align Qatar with the West, specifically the United States, who at this time was the global superpower. After the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein's Iraq in 1990, all bets were off on the safety and sovereignty of Arab states within the Middle East. And with Qatar having the world's third largest reserves of natural gas, the jewel of Arabia would seem a tempting prize to be taken. So with Qatar and Al Thani reading the room for the region, they realized they needed to make themselves an indispensable ally, not only to the West, but to also Eastern powers. And the opportunity of a lifetime would present itself.
Hi, Boston Center, Team U. We have a problem here. We have a hijacked aircraft headed towards New York.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way.
The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
In 2001, the infamous 9/11 attacks happened, sparking America and the West's global war on terror. The US already had an air base in Qatar, namely the Al Udeid Air Base, which is the largest air base in the Middle East of the United States, and it dramatically ramped up its operations during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars to service US service personnel on the ground in both of those conflicts. This dramatically increased the importance and significance of Qatar as an indispensable ally to the United States and NATO in the region. But unlike other traditional Western allies in the Middle East region that have specific ties only to the West or a certain regional bloc, Qatar decidedly carved its own path. It didn't just want to be an ally to the West, but it wanted to be an ally to everyone in a very interesting way. And the way this came is straight from the top, from the political elite of Qatar. Every foreign minister of Qatar is also the head of state of Qatar. So their foreign affairs are intrinsically tied to one another. So following the status quo just wouldn't do for Qatar. They had to think outside the box. While most Gulf states have completely shunned or limited relations with Iran, Qatar, on the other hand, has maintained cordial and sometimes even seen as close relations with Iran. Both Iran and Qatar have legal territorial claims to the South Par North Field gas reservoir, which is the third largest natural gas field in the world. And with Qatar seeing the results of what natural resource disputes with neighboring regional powers could do vis-a-vis Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, the Qataris smartly decided to negotiate and exploit the gas field jointly with Iran, easing any tensions between the Gulf nation and its major neighbor power, Iran. This would lead the Qataris to be an important mediator between Iranian interests and Saudi interests in the Middle East region. The way Qatar would mediate Iran and Saudi relations would typically be through state-on-state mediation, where members of the state of Saudi Arabia or the state of Iran will go to Qatar and have diplomatic meetings and talks. But that's not the only method Qatar uses in their locker book to have negotiations amongst these people. One other method Qatar has used, by proxy of Iran and Saudi Arabia using non-state actor groups in the Middle East region, is that Qatar has developed an uncanny ability to have non-state actors negotiate in Doha. When Western powers need to contact non-state actors through unofficial channels, in back channels, under the cover of secrecy of intelligence agencies, they go to Qatar. Qatar has unprecedented access to non-state actor groups such as Hezbollah, Hamas, the Taliban, and Al-Qaeda. Their networks reach so deep that when the CIA or Mossad needs somebody to negotiate and mediate between these groups for prison swaps, for exchanges, they go to the Qataris first. And through this unspoken rule, Qataris have made themselves indispensable to negotiating between major states and non-state actor groups in the Middle East. But not everything the Qataris touch turns to gold. And this unconventional way of diplomacy would come back to haunt them in 2017. With almost the entire Middle East shutting them out politically and economically, the Arab League, led by Saudi Arabia and Mohammed bin Salman, accused Qatar of not only hosting terrorist financiers, but also that these terrorist groups were sponsored by the Qatari government itself. Saudi Arabia accused Qatar and Iran of supporting Al-Qaeda operatives in Saudi Arabia. The United States also accused Qatar of allowing internationally blacklisted financiers to live and operate freely within Qatar's borders. None of this is more obvious than the fact that the leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah are based in Qatar. Saudi Arabia and many other Arab countries found Qatar's increasing role as a mediator between non-state groups, Iran and the United States, as a threat to their diplomatic supremacy in the region. So with the 2017 to 2021 Qatari crisis, the expectation by the Saudi-led coalition with MBS was that Qatar would finally keel in to Saudi Arabia's diplomatic supremacy in the Middle East. Instead, this completely backfired, and Qatar was pushed into Iran and Turkey's hands, as they are both very strong regional powers in the Middle East and also enemies of Saudi Arabia. While the Qatari crisis was ongoing between Qatar and the Saudi-led coalition, this was very precarious in the eyes of the United States. The US needs a neutral arbiter in the Middle East to maintain diplomatic leverage for any future agreements between non-state actors or between different government factions in the Middle East. This means for the United States that Qatar has to play an active role in mediating and negotiating in the Middle East. It wasn't until the Kuwaiti-US brokered negotiation in 2021 that hostilities had thawed between the Saudi group and Qatar. And in 2022, President Joe Biden announced that Qatar would be designated a major non-NATO ally. Another major step for Qatar solidifying its role as a strategic partner in the Middle East for major powers such as the United States and the European Union. I've talked a lot so far about the history of Qatari diplomacy, but I want to show you two prime examples of how Qatari diplomacy works. And I'm going to show you two examples that are probably most familiar to people in the West. The first is the Doha Accords. The Doha Accords was the Taliban-US deal under President Donald Trump to end the 20-year war in Afghanistan.
I started the process, all the troops are coming back home. It's a shame. 21 years by a government that wouldn't last. The only way they last is if we're there. 21 years is enough, don't we think? 21.
And an agreed settlement between the Afghan government and the Taliban regime. We already know what happened to this. The second and most recent event are the Israeli-Hamas hostage negotiations of late 2023. Qatar, Egypt, and the United States mediated talks between Hamas, Mossad agents in Qatar for the release of Israeli hostages in exchange for the release of Palestinians that were arrested in Israel, and a ceasefire in Gaza during that exchange period. These are both examples of Qatar being a central linchpin to diplomacy in the Middle East and an invaluable asset for negotiations amongst belligerent parties in the Middle East. To see what Qatari leadership has done, how it has turned a relatively small and insignificant island nation in the heart of one of the most politically volatile regions in the entire world to an indispensable mediator of the region and one of the world's most powerful actors is nothing less than impressive. Out of necessity or out of audacity, Qatar has firmly established itself as one of the most important allies for diplomacy in the Middle East. While Qatar's role as a regional mediator in the Middle East cannot be understated, it is important to note that currently we are trending towards a multipolar world, where superpowers such as China, Russia, the European Union, and the United States are vying for power and influence on the global stage. They are setting up spheres of influence for their diplomatic, political, and economic hegemony. And right now, we are witnessing a great race for these spheres of influence.
And bring Africa and the United States even closer than ever.
Безвозмездно предоставить Буркина-Фасо, Зимбабве, Мали, Сомали.
China will always be a good friend, a good partner, and a good brother of Africa. No one can destroy the great unity of the Chinese and African.